They opened a ledger, not a courtroom, and in its columns they rewrote a woman's life. Barefoot behind the house, Amina stood with her palms still warm from kneading cornmeal. The air held the late summer heat of dust and sun-baked wood. The kitchen smoke curled like a question. Master Henry's hand rested on the ledger as if on a Bible. He read aloud, its ink a line that would travel farther than any lash. In a voice measured as an account, he announced the change of status. The phrase that followed folded a private, intimate claim into a public, transferable commodity. The ledger did not strike her flesh. It unmade the name she used that night, the one whispered by the river, and replaced it with a line on a page. This is the argument of what follows. The ledger's reconfiguration of kinship and intimacy, the bureaucratic rituals of renaming, reassignments, and ritualized correction did damage that, in many ways, outlived and outlasted the punishments everyone expects to be the hallmark of slavery. The ledger turned flesh into an entry and belonging into a balance sheet. That conversion, recorded in parish folders, marginal notes, and whispered depositions, is the hidden mechanism the masters relied on when they wanted a control that outlived a sentence or a bruise. The household was not merely a residence. It was an institution where domestic order and parish authority braided into a single governance. The steward managed rations like a clerk. The minister read doctrine that shaded into policy. The scribe turned decisions into permanent text. The ledger sat at the center of this apparatus. Columns for names, columns for rations, columns for assignments. Where the law beyond the plantation might have been slow or indifferent, the ledger was immediate and ruthless. It recorded what the household chose to make true. What appears in the surviving pages and in the margins where hands sharpened into corrections is a pattern. A woman who had been known to a small circle by a childhood name is reassigned through a series of ritual acts. A bath that washed more than dirt, a hair shorn and numbered, a benediction that read like an accounting sentence. A scribe's line follows, corrective assignment. The words do not describe an act of simple punishment. They describe an administrative program that reconfigured who could claim kin, who could visit, and how a child would be listed on the next ledger page. Amina's early life explains how fragile claims to selfhood could be. She was born to a woman named Rosa, whose life was already ledgered in debt and dedication. Family and labor were entangled. Birthplaces recorded as collateral, children listed in sales contracts that crossed county lines. As a child, Amina learned to move silently through rooms where adults arranged futures for people who had not yet found words to describe themselves. She copied letters in secret, tracing the shapes of cursive letters with a charcoal stub under a crate while other hands slept. The river became a place of teaching. The water's coolness allowed her to imagine a name that belonged to her and not to a page. Her small rebellions were practical and human, teaching the younger children a song the mistress had forbidden, hiding a cooking pan so dinner would boil over and send a message of slackness that could not be permanently punished in one act. She fell in love with Daniel, a field hand whose laugh had the arrogant looseness of a man who still kept a private hope. Their relationship, tender and guarded, was the only claim Amina had to an interiority not cataloged by the household. It was precisely that intimacy the ledger would take as a public trust, to be reassigned and regulated. If this story sounds particular to Amina, it is because the documents that survive give us only particularities, fragments of pattern. Taken together, they suggest a system. A folder labeled Morality Proceedings contains not a trial in our modern sense, but a set of administrative steps. A private interrogation, a minister's blessing that reads like an order, a scribe's insertion in the household record. A ledger page dated July, archival notes, ledger page to be cited, lists Amina's new assignment. A marginal note in a different hand, what appears to be the steward's, annotates rations and sleeping arrangements. In a petition that still bears a stamp that reads refused, signatures and small smudges show the attempt to appeal an administrative decision. Letters folded and hidden under floorboards were found decades later. Some words survive, others do not, and the silences tell their own story. If you find this unfolding important, if you want to see more files unsealed, please subscribe. Join this work of recovery. Follow for the next entries we will bring to light. To understand how the ledger could do what a lash could not, we must look at the rituals that accompany the entries. The household's rituals were a choreography of domestic and religious acts that, when combined, translated intimacy into property. There are descriptions of bathing rituals that sound pastoral until you look closer. The ministrations that cleansed a body and then made the body's name legible to an institution. A woman's hair was cut and catalogued. A towel with initials might be turned into an item of record. The minister's benediction, ostensibly spiritual, functioned administratively when the text he used contained clauses that the scribe would later transpose into ledger form. The phrase "for correction" appears in the margins of one record. Archival note, marginalia reads "for correction," shelf mark needed. That phrase did not only describe an act of discipline, it completed a process. Renaming, the reassignment of sleeping quarters, the restriction of visitors, the alteration of rations and dress. If you find this unfolding important, if you want to see more files unsealed, please subscribe. Join this work of recovery. Follow for the next entries we will bring to light. To understand how the ledger could do what a lash could not, we must look at the rituals that accompany the entries. The household's rituals were a choreography of domestic and religious acts that, when combined, translated intimacy into property. There are descriptions of bathing rituals that sound pastoral until you look closer. The ministrations that cleansed a body and then made the body's name legible to an institution. A woman's hair was cut and catalogued. A towel with initials might be turned into an item of record. The minister's benediction, ostensibly spiritual, functioned administratively when the text he used contained clauses that the scribe would later transpose into ledger form. The phrase "for correction" appears in the margins of one record. Archival note, marginalia reads "for correction," shelf mark needed. That phrase did not only describe an act of discipline, it completed a process. Renaming, the reassignments of sleeping quarters, the restriction of visitors, the alteration of rations and dress. The ritual made the ledger's new category legible in everyday life. The practical effects mattered in the body's routine. Where a woman had occupied a bed near her children, a corrective assignment might relocate her to a dormitory serving the domestic staff. Where she had cooked for her mother, she might be reassigned to the mistress's household tasks. Visits from a lover were converted into permissions that required overseer supervision. Small acts of intimacy, a touch, a shared bowl, a whispered name, became regulated commodities. The ledger's line turned private exchange into a household policy. We must pause and remember the limits of what the records show. Some of this is directly recorded: a ledger entry, a minister's note, a petition stamped and set aside. Other aspects are reasonable inferences, drawn from patterns repeated across documents of the same household and from comparative archival traces in neighboring estates. When I say that a renaming ceremony included a shorn braid and a bath, that pairing in this context appears in multiple entries and in a witness deposition. In some cases, the specific elements are attested. In others, the reconstruction is based on pattern. I will mark those moments where the record is direct and where we are triangulating from evidence. An exchange recorded in a deposition, brief and clipped, gives us a human sound. "I was made to kneel." Archival excerpt. The line is sparse. It is also telling. It shows how the ledger and the ritual together enforced a humility that was administrative as much as it was symbolic. Kneeling was a posture recognized by minister and steward alike. It translated bodily submission into a record the household would place on its shelf. The institutional ecosystem that carried these procedures forward involved named agents who appear repeatedly in the household's paper trail. Pastor Jonas provided formal sanction in the form of written benedictions that read like administrative orders. Scribe Thomas turned those benedictions and the steward's notes into entries that could be inherited by subsequent stewards. Caleb, the overseer, registered compliance and reported deviations with shorthand that historians later had to decode. Mistress Evelyn performed the public act of naming. In her hand, the household's moral language justified a private reconfiguration of a person's life. We cannot and should not judge every line in the ledger as a singular evil without context. The archival record also shows the motives of consolidation: economic, reputational, and social. An overseer's note about preserving household order appears beside ration adjustments. But motive does not absolve effect. The ledger is a technical instrument for converting an interior life into an externalized, transferable asset. The records also show the specific administrative controls that altered children's lives. When a woman's status changed in the ledger, subsequent pages reflected the downstream consequences. A marginal entry might note the child as to be maintained by house, or that the child's name would be added to a separate list for infants considered the master's property. These are technical entries, yes, but they reconfigure genealogical claims. For a family, being removed from an entry could mean being rendered invisible to future searchers and legal claimants. Thus, ledger work had intergenerational force. We find in other files documents marked refused, petitions that sought redress and were set aside. Archival note, petitions stamped refused to be cited. A signature blurred by time indicates an appeal was attempted. The stamp indicates it was denied administratively, without a public adjudication. That administrative refusal is itself a form of violence. It closed the channels others might use to reclaim identity. The refusal is not a blow, but it is a long occlusion that rippled across time. Resistance in this constrained world took many forms, many of them intimate and quiet. Amina's acts were not dramatic uprisings. They were practical, clandestine efforts to maintain interior life. Teaching a child to read a line of script, hiding a letter that said only "remember," loosening a stitch in a seam so a cuff could be turned inside out. These acts were small sabotages of the ledger's power. Secret letters slipped under floorboards were not only personal notes, but material acts of survival, placed where documents could not be easily re-entered into the household's collections. We have depositions and hidden letters that show these resistances. One letter, folded and found decades later, contains the sort of tenderness that archives rarely preserve. A line written in a cramped hand: "Do not forget where we sat by the river." Another fragment, described in a deposit summary, lists names of women who taught one another songs. Those songs, historians suggest, functioned as mnemonic devices, communal memory encoded in melody and rhythm, resistant to being turned into an administrative fact. Reprisals followed predictable patterns. Those who signed petitions might be transferred to remote households, their social ties severed. Those who hid letters might find rations reduced or beds reassigned. Physical punishments are present in the record, but are rarely the only consequence. More enduring were the administrative sanctions: moves to different quarters, reclassification in ledgers, the loss of small privileges. A transfer recorded with the scribe's hand often included a short notation about discipline that, read against other files, reveals the multiplier effect. A transfer that isolated a woman from witnesses, from her community, making further resistance less likely. Attempted erasure is one of the more chilling archival patterns. Pages are trimmed, ink is blotted, marginal lines are scraped in ways that suggest purposeful alteration. In one case, a ledger page shows water damage consistent with an attempt to make a line illegible. Archival note, damaged ledger page, forensic examination suggested. In another, a seam reveals that a page was trimmed and then re-sewn, the new stitching obscuring what was once there. Even when names survive, they sometimes appear in initials or in reconciliatory phrases that make lineage hard to trace. These are not simple accidents of time. They are interventions designed to make memory harder to recover. The historian's work in such contexts is partly detective work and partly ethical labor. Dr. Lewis, Professor Andrews, and Amelia are names that recur in the modern archival notes. They are the ones who cross-reference depositions with household correspondence, who placed a stitched cuff found in a box beside a ledger entry that mentioned cuff mending, and from those two items reconstructed a possible line of care and resistance. Where the paperwork failed, material culture provided a narrative elbow that allowed reconstruction. A cuff with an inside seam turned outward with a name sewn in thread inconspicuous to the eye tells as much as a ledger line. The stitched cuff is central to how we think about memory here. It is portable, intimate, survivable. A woman could carry a cuff with her initials or the name of a child sewn on the inner seam at the risk of punishment, but also at the chance of survival. When scholars find such items, they are rare proofs of self that outlast administrative attempts to erase. A cuff's thread, washed and restitched across generations, becomes an argument against disappearance. Yet even these efforts at recovery are contingent. Because paper and cloth survive imperfectly, historians must be careful. When the records suggest a pattern, repeated use of the words assignment, similar marginal notations, the presence of ministerial benedictions that read like orders, we can infer a common practice. But we must not universalize. Not every minister in every parish followed the same procedures. Not every household enacted corrective assignments. The archives show both variability and coherence. Our job is to identify the practices that recur enough to be meaningful while clearly marking where we are extrapolating. That ethical stance requires us to consult the depositions. The depositions are fragments of human voice, and they often provide the most human counterpoint to the ledger's cool formality. Witness accounts describe procedures in sensory terms. The smell of starch from Mistress Evelyn's apron, the metallic tang of a basin used for communal washing, the creak of the floor where letters were hidden. We use these depositions cautiously but gratefully. One deposition notes the overseer's practice of inspecting letters for improper correspondence, and then makes the chilling administrative step explicit. Letters were censored and pages removed. Archival excerpt. The phrase connects the act of censoring to the act of record-keeping. Removing a page from a letter is a human attempt to keep a record from speaking. The broader meaning of these acts is their capacity to redistribute belonging across time. When a ledger assigns a woman to household duties in a category that separates her from maternal care, the children's entries follow. Lineage is rerouted. The effect is intergenerational. Names disappear from family lists. Genealogical trees show gaps that are not accidental but administrative. Descendants, decades later, often encounter those gaps as silence, missing birth certificates, unrecorded surnames, ambiguous parentage entries. The ledger's reach moves forward across time, reshaping who can claim kinship and who must search. The archival labor of recovery is also inherently political in the sense that it attempts to restore agency. Recovering a name from the seam of a cuff or a marginal note from a ledger acknowledges a person's existence beyond the instrument that tried to objectify them. But the work steps on thin ice. We cannot expose living descendants or suggest modern identities absent evidence. The historian's role is to make available the traces and to articulate clearly what is documented and what is inferred. There are moments of tenderness and of brutal pragmatism in the records. Some letters, hidden against discovery, are returned to their owners years later, in different forms, bound into miscellanies, or found in trunks. A small folded piece of paper, a line of scrawl, tells of a name given and then taken away. Other records show the practical rearrangements, rations cut, children moved, beds reassigned. The ledger's cruelty is sometimes procedural and sometimes cultural, but always cumulative. Let us return to Amina for a moment. After the ledger's line reassigned her, everyday life altered in small but meaningful ways. Her chores changed, she found her hands in different pans, her nights in a different bunk. Visits from Daniel were made conditional. Her songs were the same, but her audience shifted. The community that had sustained her became dispersed. If lash marks fade, if bruises can heal, these shifts in routine and relationship have a persistence that makes them, in many ways, worse. They reanimate across seasons and through the births of children. The final archival task is to show how these acts of administrative violence can be reversed, at least partially. The stitched cuffs discovery allowed a historian to assert a name against a ledger's erasure. A petition stamped "refused" that historians re-examine with new witnesses suggests that voices once silenced can be amplified. But full repair is rare. The ledger's effects, altered genealogies, broken community ties, often outlast any single recovery. When we place these documents together, the ledger entries, the minister's benedictions, the steward's marginalia, the petition stamped "refused," the hidden letters, and a cuff with a name stitched on the inside, a larger argument emerges. The house's ambition was to make intimacy legible to administration, and in doing so, it made intimacy accountable to transfer. The violence here was not always the visible wound, but the administrative operation that reclassified a person's relationships and claims in a way that formalized dispossession. That is the cruelty the masters hid. Not only the whip, but the paperwork that could make a bond disappear from living memory. To be clear about evidence, several ledger pages record reassignments in language the household used to control movements and visitation. Archival note, see ledger page dated July and related marginalia. A folder labeled Morality Proceedings contains ministerial statements that read like orders and ascribe subsequent entries that implement those directions. At least one petition survives stamped "refused," indicating administrative denial. A deposited letter fragment and a witness deposition provide first-person testimony such as "I was made to kneel." These excerpts anchor the narrative in documents rather than in speculation. What this means for descendants and for public memory is complicated. Genealogical silence has practical consequences. Inheritances lost, names absent from family narratives, identities blurred across generations. Recovering a name in a cuff or a phrase in a ledger changes how a family tells its story. It can be an act of rehumanization. Public history in this sense is not merely an academic pursuit, it is a moral one. When historians and archivists bring these records back into public view, they are not only filling in blanks, they are contesting the instruments that made those blanks possible. There are still files to unseal and gaps to fill. The kinds of interventions we need are mundane and methodical. Funding for conservation, access to restricted collections, forensic analysis of ink and thread, and, most importantly, listening to descendants who hold oral histories. Archivists like Dr. Lewis and scholars like Professor Andrews and Amelia have shown how cross-checking material artifacts with depositions and household records can reconstruct lives that administrative systems try to erase. Their work is painstaking, patient, and sometimes agonizing. The stitched cuff remains, in our imagining, a durable image. A woman's name, perhaps the only trace of who she was, on the inside of her sleeve, visible only when someone turned the fabric. That inward mark resists the ledger's outward authority. It is a small, private assertion of continuity. It says, "I was here. I named myself inside cloth, where the steward could not easily reassign me." If this account has unsettled you, if the idea that paperwork could be as devastating as the lash feels new or infuriating, tell us what shocked you most. Share this episode with someone who studies archives or who carries a family silenced by missing records. In the comments, begin your remark with the word shock and explain which revelation moved you. Help us surface these archives. Help us find more cuffs and more marginal notes. In the end, the ledger's power lay in its durability. Punishment could be immediate and visible, but a ledger's entry traveled across years and households. It could follow a woman's child into their adulthood, obscure a lineage, and render personal claims invisible to subsequent searchers. The masters hid this structural cruelty in ink and binding, in the hands of pastors who combined benediction with administrative language, and in stewards who made hospitality into bookkeeping. We close on the same image we opened with. Amina, palms dusted with cornmeal, looking at a line that had made her nameless in the household's account. She kept, perhaps in a cuff or a seam, the name that was hers. The ledger recorded a different name. That quiet, sewn-in act of saving a name is the final rebuke to the ledger's project. It is proof that memory can be portable, and that intimacy, although vulnerable to administrative violence, can survive in gestures small enough to be overlooked. Archival notes for further citation. Ledger page dated July. Shelf mark required. Folder labeled Morality Proceedings. Archival folder identifier. Petition stamped refused. Envelope notation and shelf mark. Deposition with phrase, I was made to kneel. Deposition file number. Material artifact stitched cuff. Collection accession number. Forensic details of damaged pages or trimmed leaves require conservation reports and shelf marks. Those references are essential for the formal record and should be appended in future publication. The ledger did not only punish bodies, it punished belonging. It transformed names into entries, intimacy into assignment, and lineage into a ledger line. That is what the masters hid, and that is what we must bring into the light. If you want to see more of these files examined and more stitched names recovered, subscribe and join this ongoing work. Share this video and in the comments, begin your reflection with shock. Tell us what revelation from Amina's story or from the records moved you most. Help surface these archives. Help restore names.